What drives an old man who has lived his entire life in the taiga to go against all the laws of nature and human society? This question had not yet formed in Petr Stepanovich's mind when the chilly October wind carried a distant, muffled crack to his ears. It was not a gunshot. Rather, it was a dry pop that was immediately swallowed up by the taiga. But Peter, whose hearing, at over 70 years of age, had become attuned to the forest, froze. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a valuable carbine, not his old father's double-barreled shotgun. He slowly straightened up, putting down his axe, and looked north, where centuries-old pine trees propped up the low, gray sky. Smoke from the chimney of his lonely hut rose straight up, then bent sharply in the gust of wind. Alarm, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, stabbed him in the ribs. He did not go into the house. Instead, he threw on an old coat, checked that his knife was still in its sheath on his belt, and without looking back, strode deeper into the forest. His footsteps were silent. He walked on the moss and fallen pine needles as only those who were born and raised here know how. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's begin. He walked for about an hour, guided by barely noticeable landmarks, a broken branch, trampled moss, a bird that flew away against its will. All of this was a language that Peter understood better than human speech. Finally, he came out onto a small clearing near an old wolf's den, and he froze. The air smelled of gunpowder and death. 2 wide tracks from a snowmobile were visible in the trampled snow that had fallen the night before. And nearby, at the entrance to the den, she lay, a she-wolf. Large, strong, the mistress of these places. Her gray fur was matted and soaked with dark blood. Her glassy eyes stared at the leaden sky with silent reproach. Peter approached. 2 cartridge cases from an imported rifle glinted in the snow. He didn't even pick them up. He knew whose work this was. In their village of Sosnovka, only one person could afford such a snowmobile and such a carbine. Viktor Agif, the owner of the sawmill. A man for whom the forest was nothing more than a set of cubic meters. Peter clenched his fists, feeling powerless rage rising from the depths of his soul. He looked around the ravaged place. The poachers hadn't even taken the skin. They had killed it for fun, to demonstrate their power. And at that moment, in the deafening silence of the dead forest, he heard it. Barely audible, thin as a mosquito's squeak. A cry, it came from the darkness of the den. The old man's heart skipped a beat. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the cold, and looked inside. There, deep inside, huddled together in a tight, trembling ball, they lay. 4 tiny creatures. Still blind, covered in dark, almost black down, they poked at each other in search of their mother's warmth, not understanding that it would never come again. Their squeaks were a desperate plea for life in the face of imminent death. The law of the taiga was simple and cruel. They were doomed. They would die of hunger or cold in the next few hours. Anyone else in Peter's place would have walked on by. The hunter inside him said not to interfere, not to disrupt the order of things. But the man looking at these defenseless orphans now could not. He did not see predators before him. He saw children who had just lost their mother. Slowly, very carefully, he reached inside with his rough, calloused hands. Hands that had taken life and given life in this forest. He picked up a warm, trembling bundle and pressed it to his chest under his old coat. Then another, and another. When all 4 were tucked under his coat, he stood up. Without looking back at the dead she-wolf, he walked back to his house. He didn't know what he would do next. He knew only one thing. He couldn't leave them to die. This step, taken against all the rules, changed his life forever, and as he would learn many years later, not only his. In the village of Sosnovka, news spread faster than a forest fire. But the secret of Peter Zakharov remained safely hidden behind the walls of his hut and a high fence. The villagers considered him a weirdo, an unsociable old man who talked more to trees than to people. That was what saved him. No one ventured onto his property without an invitation, and he never gave out invitations. The first few weeks were the hardest. The wolf cubs needed warmth and food every few hours. Peter, who had raised 2 children and was already babysitting his grandchildren, felt helpless. He got some goat's milk from his neighbor, Baba Masha, lying that he was ill and the doctor had prescribed it. Using an old pipette he found in his late wife's medicine cabinet, he fed each of the 4. They were hungry for life. They grabbed the rubber with their blind mouths, grunted, and jostled each other. Peter made a nest for them in the far corner of the shed, in an old box lined with hay and his own jacket. He hardly slept, constantly checking to see if they were cold or hungry. He tried to talk to them as little as possible and not to touch them unnecessarily. He remembered the main rule. These were not puppies. They were wolves, and their home was the forest. He was just giving them a chance to live until they could return there. Meanwhile, life in the village went on as usual. Viktor Agiyev, the owner of the sawmill, felt great. His business was booming. He had just signed a lucrative contract to supply wood to the city, and now his log trucks were pounding the country roads day and night. He just grinned at the residents' complaints that they were ruining the last stretch of road. One evening, he sat in the local store, which had been turned into a makeshift bar, and boasted loudly to his workers. "The taiga, guys, it's like a woman. It loves strength. Whoever is stronger gets what he wants," he said, pouring himself another shot of vodka. "The other day, we thinned out the gray predators. Otherwise, they would have multiplied and soon invaded the vegetable gardens." Peter, who had come in for salt and matches, heard these words. He stopped at the doorway, his gaze meeting Agiyev's heavy, mocking stare. Not a word was spoken, but in that silence, everything was said. Accusation, contempt, hatred, and defiance. Peter silently bought what he had come for and left. He knew that Agiyev was one of those who had fired the shots. Perhaps it was his bullet that had taken the wolf's life. And now this man was celebrating his victory, unaware that the 4 little lives he had condemned to death were now warm and safe just a kilometer away from him. This thought warmed Peter more than the stove in his house. It was his little secret victory. A year passed. 4 slender, strong young wolves grew out of the blind balls of fur. Peter could no longer keep them in the barn. They needed space. He moved them to a large pen behind the house, which he fenced off with a high wire mesh. Each of them had already shown its character. The largest and bravest, with a dark stripe on its back, whom Peter secretly called the leader, always ate first and started all the games. The second, a graceful gray wolf, was the smartest and most cautious. Gray, as Peter thought of her. The third, the fastest and most agile, constantly trying to squeeze under the fence, was nicknamed Tail. And the fourth, the darkest, almost black, was the most affectionate and trusting. He was the only one who allowed Peter to sometimes scratch him behind the ear. Blackie. The old man knew that the time was right. He began to take them out into the forest. At first, he kept them on leashes, like dogs, which looked strange and ridiculous. Then he let them loose in a clearing and watched from a distance. He brought them rabbit carcasses, but didn't give them to them. Instead, he hid them and made them search for them by smell. He taught them to read tracks. He showed them the danger of traps, which he set himself and disabled in front of them. It was a strange school, where the teacher was a man and the students were the future kings of the taiga. Meanwhile, a new police officer was sent to Sosnovka. The young lieutenant, Alexei Sokolov, seemed like a black sheep in this wilderness. Fit in a perfectly ironed uniform, he began to impose order from the very first days. He chased away drunks, fined people for littering, and much to Viktor Agiv's displeasure, began asking questions about his sawmill. Viktor Pavlovich, why do you have receipts for timber deliveries for last month, but the trucks are driving every day? Alexei asked politely, but insistently. Agiv waved him off, trying to use his authority, but the district police officer was relentless. He met Peter during his rounds. He came in, introduced himself, and looked around the farm. His keen eye noticed the high fence and the unusually large amount of meat scraps in the dog's bowl. But he said nothing. An unspoken understanding arose between the two men, old and young. They both stood on one side of an invisible front against Agiv's predatory barbarism. Alexei left, but Peter knew he would return, and the danger to his secret grew with each passing day. It was becoming increasingly difficult to hide the wolves. Their howls at night grew louder and more confident, and these howls could no longer be ignored by the one who considered himself the sole master of this forest. The day that Peter had both been waiting for and dreading had arrived. It was a spring day when the taiga finally awoke. He opened the gate to the enclosure. The leader came out first, uncertainly but resolutely. Behind him, looking back, came Gray. Tail and Black came out last, still not believing in their freedom. They stopped at the edge of the forest, turned around, and looked at the old man. There was no dog-like devotion in their yellow eyes. There was something else. Recognition, understanding, a connection that had no name in human language. Peter didn't move. He just nodded to them, and they left. They disappeared into the greenery like ghosts. That night, Peter sat on the porch for a long time, listening to the silence. For the first time in a year and a half, the house seemed deafeningly empty. He didn't know if he had done the right thing. Would they survive? Would they come to human dwellings in search of easy prey? Would they fall victim to the first hunter they encountered? He sat there until dawn, but heard not a sound. The forest remained silent. A week passed, then another. Peter found their tracks farther and farther from home. They were learning to live without him, and he was learning to live without them. But one evening, while patrolling his territory, he froze. At the edge of the forest, where his territory began, he saw fresh tracks, not wolf tracks. The tracks of heavy, expensive boots. And nearby, pressed into the mud, lay the butt of an imported cigarette. Only one person in Sosnovka smoked that brand, Viktor Agiv. He had been here. He had been looking for something, and at that very moment, from the direction the tracks led, a howl came from deep in the forest. But it was not a single voice. It was a coordinated chorus of 4 wolves. His pack. They were alive. They were together. but they were dangerously close, and the enemy already knew about them. Peter rushed into the hut and grabbed his old double-barreled shotgun. He didn't know who he was going to defend or from whom. He only knew that a big hunt was about to begin. But Peter did not rush into the forest with his gun at the ready. The rage that had boiled inside him a moment ago was replaced by cold, clear calculation. He was a hunter, not a fighter. He knew that running headlong into the darkness was a sure way to lose. He silently returned to the hut, leaned the double-barreled shotgun against the doorframe where it always stood, and sat down at the table. His hands, usually as firm as roots, trembled slightly. The howling subsided. Now the forest was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. Tense. Like a taut bowstring, they had made themselves known. His wolves, his foolish, brave children, and he wasn't the only one who heard them. Victor Agif had undoubtedly heard them too, and he wasn't the kind of man to forgive challenges. The war was no longer a secret. It had become clear. Peter looked out the dark window, but instead of his reflection, he saw 4 pairs of yellow eyes looking trustingly at him from the past. And he made a vow to himself. He would not betray them. The next day, the whole of Sosnovka was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. The news was brought by one of Agiv's lumberjacks, who had returned late and heard the howling very close to the outskirts. The news, generously seasoned with fiction and fear, spread from house to house. A whole flock, huge, like calves. Their eyes burn with red fire. Soon they'll start slaughtering the cattle in the barns. Victor Agif skillfully conducted this chorus. Sitting in his office at the sawmill, he played the role of a concerned defender of the village. "This is no good, men," he said to the 3 most talkative and drunk hunters. "This is a threat to our children, our cows. By the time the authorities get their act together, we'll be left without livestock." He opened a desk drawer and laid a thick wad of cash on the table. 50,000 for each skin. 4 wolves. 4 skins, 200,000. Whoever brings them will get the money. Consider it a bonus from me personally, for the peace of the village. The men's eyes lit up with greed. 200,000 was a huge amount of money for Sosnovka. That same evening, they were already cleaning their old rifles, loudly discussing how they would divide the skins and the glory. Peter saw all this while buying bread. He felt the sidelong, condemning glances. Someone was already whispering behind his back. "But Zakharov is one of us. He goes into the forest. He must have bribed them, the old geezer." The isolation around him grew. He became a stranger among his own people. Alexei Sokolov, the local police officer, found out about the unauthorized reward an hour later. It was a direct violation of the law. He got into his official Niva and drove first to Agiev. The conversation was short and fruitless. Victor smiled insolently. "Alexei Igorovich." "What are you talking about?" "What award? I just promised the men a bonus for good work." "What they've decided to do is their business. I can't forbid them from walking in the forest in their free time." The lie was obvious, but impossible to prove. Then Alexei drove to the other end of the village, to Peter's house. He found the old man on the porch again, as if he had been waiting for him. "Peter Stepanovich, hello," the police officer began without preamble. "You've heard what's going on. Agiv has set the whole village against the forest. I need to know the truth. About the wolves. Are they really here?" Peter was silent for a long time, studying the young lieutenant's face. He saw neither curiosity nor fear in it. He saw a desire to get to the bottom of the matter. The forest is their home. the old man finally said slowly. They've come home. They haven't hurt anyone. They're getting in Agiev's way. Alexei nodded. They're getting in the way of his dirty business. He's cutting down the forest in the reserve, and I've almost gathered enough evidence. The wolves are just extra witnesses who could attract the attention of the inspectors. That's why he wants them gone. Peter looked at the police officer with respect for the first time. I can't allow this vigilante justice, Alexei continued. But without your help, I'm powerless. I don't know the forest like you do. I don't know where to look for them to get ahead of the hunters. The old man was silent again, but Alexei saw the answer in his eyes. An unspoken agreement was reached. A week later, in the midst of these events, a bus arrived in Sosnovka. A girl with a large backpack on her shoulders and light hair tied back in a ponytail got off. It was Anna, Peter's granddaughter, a biology student who had come for a summer internship. "Grandpa," she cried, and the old gamekeeper's face momentarily lost its stern expression, lighting up with a warm smile. Anna's arrival was like a breath of fresh air in the stifling atmosphere of fear and hatred. She was intelligent, curious, and completely unafraid of the taiga's horror stories. She immediately sensed the tension in the village and noticed the rifle by the door of her grandfather's house. "Grandpa, what's going on? Why is everyone looking at you like you've seen a ghost?" she asked that evening. Looking at his grown-up granddaughter, Peter decided she had a right to know. He told her everything. About the wolf that had been killed, about the 4 puppies that had been saved, about their secret upbringing and their return to the forest. He spoke, and Anna listened, holding her breath. Her biologist's eyes were burning. This was not just a village tale. It was a unique scientific case, a fantastic example of interspecies communication and behavior. "Grandpa, that's incredible," she whispered. "We have to study them. We can't let them be harmed." From that day on, Peter had more than just an ally. He had a partner. Anna brought more than just textbooks with her. In her backpack was a modern camera with a telephoto lens and 2 camera traps. The next day, she persuaded her grandfather to show her the places where he left food and where he most often saw the herd's tracks. Peter hesitated for a long time, but his granddaughter's persistence and sincere scientific interest convinced him. They set up cameras in 2 different spots on the animal trails, carefully camouflaging them. Every day, Anna went into the forest with her grandfather, learning to read tracks and listen to the silence. She kept a detailed diary of her observations. Local hunters, seeing how old Zakharov was now taking his granddaughter into the forest, just shook their heads. Their search had so far been fruitless. The wolves seemed to have vanished into thin air. They were too smart to fall into the traps set by the village drunks. But Viktor Agiev was not going to wait. He understood that his hunters would sooner shoot each other than find the cunning beast. He made one phone call. 2 days later, an old faded UAZ 452, nicknamed Bukanka, drove into Sosnovka. 3 men in professional camouflage got out of the car. Their faces were weather-beaten, their movements were sparse and precise, and their eyes were cold and empty. They carried expensive carbines with optical sights and special equipment. These were not amateurs. These were mercenaries, professionals for whom killing a beast was just a job. They silently made their way to Agiev's office. The whole village fell silent. Even the most talkative people bit their tongues. Everyone understood. The jokes were over. Peter and Anna were sitting on the porch when they saw the UAZ. The old man slowly got up. His face turned to stone. "They're here," he said quietly. Anna looked at him and saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Almost palpable fear. But he wasn't afraid for himself. He was looking at the forest. Somewhere out there in its green depths was his family. And he looked at his granddaughter, whom he himself had brought to the line of fire. The arrival of the professionals changed everything. The village bustle was replaced by an ominous silence. The three mercenaries did not drink vodka in the store or brag about future trophies. They set up camp on the edge of a Gives plot, away from prying eyes. They silently cleaned their weapons, checked their maps, and studied satellite images of the area on a tablet. Their presence was like the ticking of a bomb's clockwork. Peter and Anna watched them from afar. "They're not like ours," Anna said quietly, lowering her binoculars. "They're different, Grandpa. They're working." Peter didn't answer. Even without binoculars, he could see the work in their precise, economical movements, in their calm confidence. He knew that these people would not leave until they had completed their mission. Alexei Sokolov understood this too. He had come to the mercenary camp in his Niva to check their documents. He was met by the oldest member of the group, a man of about 40 with faded, expressionless eyes. He politely but coldly handed the local police officer his gun license and hunting permits. Everything was in perfect order. "We are here at the invitation of Viktor Pavlovich. We are helping to shoot stray dogs that have spread throughout the area. They say they are rabid," he said monotonously, looking Alexei straight in the eye. It was a brazen but legally flawless lie. Stray dogs in the taiga. Alexei clenched his teeth. He was a representative of the law, but his hands were tied. All he could do was warn them about the illegality of hunting and leave, feeling completely powerless. The mercenary didn't even smile at him as he walked away. He simply went back to what he was doing. Peter and Anna decided to act first. They couldn't just stand by and watch anymore. "We can't stop them by force," Anna said, spreading a map of the area on the table. "But we know the forest better than they do. We know how wolves think. We have to confuse them." The plan was risky, but it was the only option. They spent the next few days in the forest. Peter used all his hunting skills to create false trails. He dragged an old wolf skin behind him, left over from his days as a hunter, laying routes that led into impassable swamps and windbreaks, far from the pack's real lair. Anna helped him, covering their own tracks and disguising their presence. They worked as a single unit, old experience and young energy, intuition and science. They felt like partisans in an occupied forest. At night, they returned home exhausted but hopeful that they had won another day for their pack. One evening, Anna took the flash drive out of the camera trap and inserted it into her laptop. The first few dozen images were blank. Then a fox appeared on the screen, followed by a wild boar. Suddenly, Anna froze. There he was, standing in the gray light of the infrared flash. The leader, large, powerful, confident. He was looking straight into the camera, as if he could sense an invisible presence. In the next frame, Gray appeared next to him, followed by Tail and Blackie. They were alive, healthy, and together. Tears of relief welled up in Anna's eyes. "Grandpa, look, they're here." Peter came over and looked at the screen. A slight smile touched his lips. But the next frame made them both freeze. The camera trap, triggered by movement, captured another figure, a man in camouflage. He was standing behind a tree, about 50 meters from the wolves, looking in their direction through the optical sight of a rifle. He wasn't shooting, he was studying. In the next picture, he slowly lowered his weapon and turned his head. His face was clearly visible. It was the same mercenary who had spoken to Alexei, and he was looking directly at the place where the camera was hidden. He had noticed it. He knew he had been seen. The game of cat and mouse had reached a new level. Now the enemy knew that he was also being watched. Fear gave way to despair. Peter realized that his tricks were no longer working. The professionals weren't falling for the false leads. They had come straight to the pack. The fact that they hadn't fired meant only one thing. They wanted to track down the lair and destroy everyone at once, for sure. There was no time left. That same night, a storm broke out. The wind howled in the chimney, and heavy rain drummed on the roof. It was the perfect conditions for covering tracks. "I'm going," said Peter, pulling on his old canvas raincoat. "Grandpa, you're crazy. Where are you going on a night like this? They'll kill you." Anna jumped up from her chair in horror. "I have to warn them," the old man replied firmly. "They know my call. There's a sound I taught them, a sound that means danger. I have to make them go away, far away to the north, to the swamps, where they won't go." He took his rifle, even though he knew it was useless against carbines with telescopic sights. It was more for his own reassurance. "I'll be back by morning," he said, and walked out the door, disappearing into the roaring darkness. Anna was left alone in the empty house, listening to the sound of the storm and praying to all the gods she didn't believe in. Peter walked through the wall of rain and wind, guided by memory. He knew this path like the back of his hand. He reached a high cliff overlooking the valley where, according to his calculations, the pack should have been. The wind was particularly strong here, knocking him off his feet. Peter leaned against a wet pine trunk, caught his breath, and then cupped his hands around his mouth. He took a deep breath and let out a sound. It wasn't a howl. It was a low, alarming, guttural sound that he used when he showed the wolf cubs the traps. A sound that should have been associated with immediate danger in their memory. He repeated it 3 times, putting all his despair and all his love for these animals into it. The sound cut through the roar of the storm and rolled through the forest. Peter stood motionless for several long minutes, listening. There was no answer, and that was good. It meant that they had heard him and were hiding or already leaving. He had done his job. He could go back. He turned to start the descent and froze. 2 steps away from him, leaning against a neighboring tree, stood a man in wet camouflage. He was holding a carbine. It was the same mercenary. He hadn't gone after the wolves. He had tracked down the one who could lead them to them. He had tracked down Peter. A dry branch cracked under his boot, and in the sound of the wind, Peter clearly heard a calm, icy voice. "You howl well, old man, almost like a real one. Now show me who you were howling at." A cold that had nothing to do with the icy rain froze Peter. He stared into the mercenary's eyes, which were as empty as gun barrels. There was no fear. There was a dull, blunt certainty that this was the end. He had lost. His attempt to save the wolves had led the enemy straight to him, and that meant to them. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Peter said slowly, his voice firm despite the howling wind. The rifle in his hands felt like a heavy, useless stick. The mercenary smiled. The corners of his lips twitched slightly. "You're coming, old man, or I'll go alone. But then I won't be able to tell the difference between the wolf and your granddaughter who's running around the forest with a camera. I saw her today. She's a quick girl. I wouldn't want her to accidentally get caught in the line of fire." It wasn't a shot. It was worse. It was a blow to the gut that knocked all the air and all the will out of him. Peter slumped his shoulders. He looked toward his house, where a single light burned in the window. Anna. He had lured not only the wolves into this trap, but her as well. There was no choice left. All right, he exhaled. I'll show you. They walked for almost 2 hours. The mercenary, who, as it turned out, was called Ignat, walked slightly behind, not allowing Peter to look back. But the old man could feel the cold breath of the barrel on the back of his head. The rain had almost stopped, giving way to a thick, damp fog that clung to the branches and made the forest ghostly and silent. Peter led him, but he wasn't leading him to the hideout. He remembered an old, abandoned bear den on the slope of a distant ravine. It was a remote and dangerous place. He hoped for only one thing: to buy time. For Anna, for Alexei, for the wolves. They reached the ravine as dawn was breaking. The fog grew even thicker. Here, said Peter, stopping at the entrance to a dark crevice under the roots of an upturned spruce tree. Ignat looked around carefully. His professional gaze scanned every bush, every stone. He was on guard. Call them, he ordered. Peter knew that if he let out his usual howl now, the wolves, if they were nearby, might respond, and that would be a death sentence. He cupped his hands together again, but this time he made a different sound, a quiet, short cry, like the cry of a wounded bird. It was a secret signal he and Chernish had used in the past, a signal that meant, "I'm here, but something's wrong. Don't come." And at that moment, something happened that no one expected. Out of the fog, as silent as shadows, they emerged, all 4 of them. They didn't come out to the den. They surrounded them. The leader stood on the trail in front, blocking the way. Gray came in on the right, Tail on the left, and Chernish, the darkest one, appeared from behind, cutting off Ignat's retreat. They didn't growl, they just stood and stared. 4 pairs of yellow eyes burning in the semi-darkness. The mercenary froze. His confidence evaporated instantly. It was one thing to track an animal through a rifle scope. It was quite another to find yourself surrounded by 4 large predators who saw you not as prey, but as an annoying obstacle on their territory. He slowly began to raise his rifle. "Don't you dare," Peter shouted. "If you shoot one, the others will tear you to pieces." But Ignat wasn't listening anymore. His finger was already on the trigger. At that moment, the leader took a step forward and made a sound for the first time. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to make the ground vibrate. Ignat flinched. He was a professional, but he was alone against a pack that acted as a single organism. He realized that these were not just animals. This was an intelligent, organized force. For the first time, fear flashed in his eyes. Meanwhile, Anna, not waiting for her grandfather to return by dawn, realized that something was wrong. She didn't panic. She did the only thing she could. Grabbing her laptop, she ran out of the house and rushed to the only place in the village where the lights were on around the clock, the police station. She burst into Alexei's office, disheveled, wet, her eyes burning with horror. "They took him. They took my grandfather. Mercenaries!" Alexei, who had been up all night trying to piece together the case against Agiv, jumped up. "Quiet, Anna. Calm down. Tell me what happened." Anna quickly opened her laptop and showed him a photo. It was a clear image of Ignat's face looking into the camera. Then she showed him a map where the camera trap had been set up. He went there, to warn them. He didn't come back. Alexei looked at the map and then at the photo. "This is proof, not direct, but it's something. He's in the reserve, with a weapon. Out of hunting season, that's enough. He grabbed the radio and the keys to the Niva. Stay here, don't go anywhere. He was already running out of the office when he gave the order to the officer on duty. Contact the district center immediately. Call in the riot police. We have armed men in the reserve, possibly with a hostage. I'll send you the coordinates. A minute later, his Niva roared to life and sped off down the muddy forest road. In the forest, the confrontation reached its peak. Ignat slowly, millimeter by millimeter, backed away, keeping his eyes on the leader. He retreated toward the ravine, apparently deciding that with his back to the cliff, he would have a better chance. The wolves did not attack. They just followed him, closing the circle. Peter stood motionless, afraid that a single movement would provoke an attack. He understood that the wolves were not protecting him. They were protecting their territory and him as part of that territory, as a familiar and understandable element of their world. Suddenly, Ignat stumbled. His foot slipped off a wet root, and he lost his balance and fell down the steep slope of the ravine. There was a dull thud and a short cry of pain. Then silence. The wolves stopped at the edge. The leader looked down, then turned his gaze to Peter. There was no malice or triumph in his eyes, only the calm dignity of the master of the forest. He turned, and giving some kind of inaudible signal, led the pack into the fog. They simply disappeared, as if they had never been there. Peter rushed to the edge of the ravine. Down below at the bottom lay Ignat. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. He was alive, but moaning in pain. His carbine lay a few meters away from him. Peter began to climb down. When he approached, the mercenary looked up at him. There was no more arrogance in his eyes, only pain and amazement. They didn't touch you, he croaked. They don't need you, Peter replied simply. At that moment, from above, from the road, came the growing roar of an engine and the wail of a siren. Alexei had arrived just in time. Alexei's appearance with his siren blaring finally dispelled the remaining fog and tense silence. He pulled off the road and stopped the Niva so that the headlights illuminated the edge of the ravine. Peter Stepanovich, are you okay? He shouted, jumping out of the car. Seeing the old man climbing down to the defeated mercenary, he rushed after him, pulling a tourniquet and bandages out of the first aid kit as he ran. Ignat, seeing the uniform, tried to reach for his carbine, but the sharp pain in his broken leg made him fall back with a groan. Alexei quickly assessed the situation. Open fracture. We need to set it and get him to a hospital, he said professionally, cutting the mercenary's pants with Peter's knife. Ignat was silent, just gritting his teeth. All his arrogance was gone, leaving only a man in pain and fear. Peter stood nearby, watching. He looked at the helpless enemy and the police officer bustling around him and felt a strange emptiness. There was no victory. There was only endless fatigue. When Alexei managed to make a splint out of 2 sticks and immobilize the leg, he looked at Peter. I called for backup. They'll be here soon, for him and his friends. He nodded upward. Now tell me what happened here. Peter told him everything. About leaving at night, about the alarm, about the trap he had fallen into, and about how the wolves had surrounded them. Alexei listened without interrupting, his face growing more serious. They didn't touch him. They just cornered him, Peter finished. Alexei looked at Ignat, who was listening to the story with his eyes half closed. You're lucky, the district police officer said quietly. Very lucky. Ignat didn't answer. Half an hour later, the crackle of Alexei's radio came from the forest. followed by the rumble of heavy equipment. A U.S. vehicle with Oman troops drove onto the road. The arrest operation was quick and quiet. Ignat's 2 accomplices were caught asleep in their camp. Agiv was arrested right in his fancy house while he was still drinking his morning coffee. He tried to call someone, shouting about his connections, but his authority was worth nothing to the masked men with automatic weapons. The news that Agiv had been taken, along with some visiting thugs, spread through Sosnovka in an instant. People poured into the streets to watch as a convoy of police cars and ambulances carrying Ignat left the village. The fear that had gripped the village for many years began to recede. People looked at Peter Zakharov's house no longer with condemnation, but with curiosity and even timid respect. They began to realize that the old gamekeeper had been waging his own invisible war and had ultimately won. When Peter and Anna stepped out onto the porch, their neighbor Baba Masha, the same woman who had given milk for the wolf cubs, approached their fence. "Stepanik, you're a good man," she said shyly and quickly walked away. It was more than just words. It was recognition. The ice had broken. A few months later, the trial took place. The case became high profile. The testimony of Ignat, who apparently decided that the person who hired him had screwed him over and that there was no point in saving him, as well as the irrefutable evidence gathered by Alexei and the data from Anna's camera traps, which were added to the case, left Viktor Agiv without a chance. He received a real prison sentence for organizing a criminal group, illegal logging on a particularly large scale, and incitement to poaching. His sawmill was sealed. 2 of his hired hunters also received prison terms. The story of Peter and his wolves became the central theme of the trial, although he himself appeared only as a witness. The newspapers called it "The Miracle in the Siberian Taiga." Anna wrote a brilliant term paper based on her diaries and photographs, which caused a sensation in her department. She was offered to continue her research and organize a scientific expedition to these places. 3 years passed. Sosnovka changed. Without Agiv's oppression, the village seemed to breathe more freely. The forest began to recover little by little. Alexei Sokolov received a promotion, but remained in the same area. He often visited Peter, no longer on duty, but simply as a friend, to drink tea and talk about life. Anna came to visit her grandfather every summer, continuing her observations. The wolf pack, led by the wise leader, became the true guardians of these places. Their presence restored the natural balance. They did not touch domestic animals, as they had enough prey in the forest. People stopped being afraid of them. They became part of local folklore, a legend told to visitors. The climax of this incredible story came during a harsh winter, 5 years after the cubs were rescued. Even the old-timers couldn't remember a winter like it. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, and blizzards cut the village off from the outside world for weeks. On one of those nights, in a neighboring village 30 kilometers from Sosnovka, a woman in labor began to have complications. She needed urgent surgery, which could only be performed at the district hospital. The roads were completely covered with snow. Their only hope was an old tracked all-terrain vehicle that had been left to the forestry department after the collapse of the Agiv Empire. A young paramedic got behind the wheel, accompanied by the woman's husband and Alexei Sokolov, who volunteered to accompany them, knowing that the journey would be dangerous. They fought their way through the snowy fog for several hours. The all-terrain vehicle roared as it rolled over snowdrifts. And in the most remote place, halfway to the district, the engine spluttered and died dead. There was no communication. All around was a white, howling desert and a frost that penetrated to the bone. They were in a deadly trap. In an hour, they would start to freeze. Then the husband of the woman in labor, peering into the blizzard, cried out in horror. Eyes were staring at them from the snowy whirlwind. Yellow, predatory eyes. Wolves, a whole pack. They slowly emerged from the fog and surrounded the stalled all-terrain vehicle. There were no longer 4 of them, but 7. The pack had grown. The people in the car froze, waiting for their inevitable death. Alexei grabbed the holster of his service pistol, even though he knew it was pointless, but the wolves did not attack. They just stood around in a tight circle, as if protecting something. The leader, huge, with gray fur on his neck, stood directly in front of the cab and stared at the people. Suddenly, he raised his head and howled. Long and powerful, his howl pierced even the roar of the blizzard. He was answered by a second voice, then a third, and soon a mighty chorus of 7 wolves rang out over the snow-covered taiga. They were not howling from hunger or rage. It was a call directed south toward a distant village, where an old man who had once given them life sat in his warm home. Peter heard the howl. He was asleep, but the sound woke him instantly. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding with anxiety. He knew that howl. His pack had never howled like that before. It was an SOS signal. He didn't know what had happened, but he sensed trouble. He quickly got dressed, threw on his sheepskin coat, grabbed a lantern, and went outside. The blizzard was so strong that it knocked him off his feet. He couldn't see anything beyond his outstretched arm. But Peter knew where to go. He followed the sound. He walked, sinking into the snowdrifts, gasping for breath, guided only by instinct and an invisible connection with his wolves. And in the stalled all-terrain vehicle, something incredible was happening. The wolves did not leave. They lay down around the car, huddled together, and their bodies and breath created an invisible barrier that prevented the icy wind from reaching the metal. The temperature inside the vehicle, which had begun to drop rapidly, stabilized. They did not warm the people in the human sense. They simply lived nearby, and their very presence, their living warmth, prevented the vehicle from turning into an icy coffin. The people looked at them through the freezing windows and couldn't believe their eyes. They didn't understand what was happening, but they felt that these animals were somehow preventing them from dying. And at that very moment, on the distant horizon, through the blizzard, a faint, flickering light appeared. It was Peter. He was coming to their rescue. What should Victor have done when the wolves surrounded him in the blizzard? Malvaux d'urgence. Try to scare them away by firing a shot into the air. B. Freeze and wait, hoping for a miracle. C. Try to slowly retreat to the nearest trees,